So the idea that we had going in is we knew that Arizona was actually had one of the best reputations in the country for serving people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mainly because so many people in those situations live at home. And that's wonderful. That's a goal of society, is to get rid of institutions and put people into the community in homes or small settings. But what we learned when we started to pull it all apart is that it's not enough simply to live at home. You need the support, and your caregivers and family members need the support to make it happen. And that's not always taking place. That I really wanted to make sure with this project that we focused on the people with disabilities themselves. That often doesn't happen with disenfranchised communities and people with disabilities in general, but it particularly doesn't happen, particularly is an issue with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities for a variety of reasons. Journalists don't know how to approach them. They don't want to do or say the wrong thing. They don't think that they'll be able to communicate. They'll talk right past them. That's something that I've experienced my daughter's whole life. So we really wanted to make sure that we focused the work on them. And of course, a few weeks in, the pandemic hit. And my plan in terms of that focus was going to be to spend a year in people's homes, in group homes, in community settings, really getting to know people, really getting to let them explain their lives and capture what was going on. And, so almost overnight that ended. We weren't able to do it that way. So we really needed to come up with some more creative and out of the box approaches to keeping the main characters in the story front and center. And then that moved into the idea of making the journalism not only about people with disabilities, but for them as well. One thing we didn't know when we set out with this project, there was the project itself, and then there were some of the audience engagement tools that we used, such as a storytelling event, and probably the most important was a plain language translation. And when we published the plain language translation, we didn't know if any other media outlet had ever done it. So we thought we were doing it correctly. I mean, we brought in a scholar to do the actual translation. We treated that translation just like we treated the regular stories. I went over it super carefully. My editor went over it. Several other editors, a copy editor, went over it. It was lawyered. So we felt pretty confident that it was, it wasn't misleading and it was characterized the story correctly. But we didn't know what it would mean to the community. And we were pleasantly surprised by the response, because I think it really demonstrated that we're just, as a profession and as a society, really at the very beginning of even considering what it means to make journalism accessible to groups that we hadn't really considered would partake of it before. Journalists absolutely have an obligation to the underserved. I would argue that really our obligation is to the truth and the reader. And so if there's a population that's underserved and there are injustices, then it's our job to try to hold people accountable for those injustices. We don't worry too much about making sure something changes. But I see my job as putting that information out there in as fair a manner as possible, and then letting other people decide. And by doing a plain language translation, I feel like we really served that, because we were able to bring people with intellectual disabilities into the conversation in a way they hadn't been before. That's not to say that was kind of the be all and end all. I think we have a lot more work to do in terms of making our journalism accessible, and we're working on some projects this year that include some focus groups and a lot of pretty in-depth research in conjunction with the academic Becca Monteleone, who did our translations, to see if we can really make this work. I thought it was before I jumped into this project, and I'm on the board of the National Center for Disability in Journalism, so we talk about this kind of thing a lot. But what we mostly talk about is accessibility to technology. So we want to make sure that we have captions. If we have an audio presentation, we want to make sure we have descriptions for the blind. There are various ways that you can alter things on the computer to make that happen. but I really hadn't thought about how we treat this population, or rather how we don't treat it, until now. So I think, again, we're just at the very beginning of even being able to consider that. There's absolutely an obligation to be accessible, but I also think you have to consider it in a real world context. So it was relatively time consuming, and it was an expense to do these plain language translations. So we wouldn't be able to do them for every single story, partly because it'd be very hard to do them for breaking news. You can't really automate it. And it's just not, there just aren't resources in newsrooms. So you can't really have the expectation. And I don't really like holding someone to a standard that when there's absolutely no way they can meet it. So I think there are a lot of things you can do in between doing nothing and doing this kind of work that we did that will make journalism more accessible. So, I mean, I think just clear writing, a lot of the ways that we put journalism together, making sure that we include narrative, even if it's investigative, so that it really pulls people in and they understand the impact of it. To me, those are issues of accessibility as much as some of the more technical things that you would think of, obviously.